This week's Torah portion brings us to the beginning of the book of Exodus. In Hebrew, the book of Exodus is called Shemot, which also is the name of this week's Torah portion. The word Shemot means names, and it comes from the first verse. Now these are the names of the sons of Israel who came to Egypt with Jacob. And interestingly, this is the portion of the Torah in which God reveals his holy name to Moses and to the people of Israel. In the ongoing narrative, many years have passed since the time of Joseph, and now the people of Israel are living under slavery in Egypt. And hanging over the narrative are the promises that God made to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Would God remember and be faithful to the promises he made to Israel? Almost as if a response to this question, it says in Exodus chapter 2, God heard Israel's groaning, and God remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. However, God does not work in a vacuum. God always chooses people to work through. So, to save his people, God had to first reveal himself to Moses and commission him to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt. We read in chapter 3 that God revealed himself to Moses through the burning bush, even going as far as revealing his own personal name. In chapter 3, verse 14, God firstly reveals his name to be I am who I am, which in Hebrew is Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, and should actually be translated as I will be who I will be. Then in the next verse, God says this, Thus you shall say to the sons of Israel, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, and this is my memorial name to all generations. In our English Bibles, whenever we see the word Lord in all caps, it is referring to God's Hebrew name, which is made up of the letters Yod, He, Vav, and He, which are transliterated into English as YHVH or YHWH. Because no one is quite sure what the vowel markings should be for this name, no one is quite sure exactly what it means or how to pronounce it. That being said, most agree that it is related to the phrase I will be who I will be, and therefore is referencing God's nature and character. In ancient Hebrew culture, a person's name does not refer just to the letters and sounds associated with a certain language, but rather to the meaning of a name, the character of the person, the reputation of the person, and the authority of the person. So in this case, God's name could very well mean He who causes to be, meaning He is the creator, He is transcendent, He himself is self-existent, and everyone else must rely on Him for existence. And this meaning was especially relevant to the Israelites because it conveyed to them that God was ultimately capable and able to bring about their rescue, that God would indeed be faithful to the promises He made to them. That being said, for God to even have a name is itself a little ironic, especially since the meaning of His name is likely supposed to get us to understand that God is beyond us, that he can't be put into a box, so to speak. And perhaps this is why it is a long-standing tradition in Judaism to not speak God's name. And while there's nothing wrong with discussing and pondering the meaning of His name, in Jewish practice, in order to keep God's name holy, it is not pronounced by anyone today. And this seems to be the practice even in the days of Jesus and the apostles, with one exception. In those days, the temple still stood. The temple in Jerusalem still stood. And so God's name was only uttered at very specific occasions by the priests, most notably by the high priest on the Day of Atonement. Now, some in the Messianic movement would object and say that since the practice of not pronouncing God's name is a tradition, we should be free to pronounce it if we wish. And some would say that we are actually being disrespectful to God by not pronouncing it. But there's actually evidence that it is indeed a biblical commandment to not pronounce God's name, or at the very least, it is a biblical tradition that was modeled for us by Jesus and the apostles. Firstly, in Exodus chapter 20, God instructed Moses concerning the construction of the altar at which the people were to worship Him. He said, You shall make an altar of earth for me, and you shall sacrifice on it your burnt offerings and your peace offerings, your sheep and your oxen. In every place where I cause my name to be remembered, I will come to you and bless you. So the text says, in every place where I cause my name to be remembered, with some translations using the word mentioned or invoked instead of remembered. According to Rashi, God was saying that there will be a specific location at which his name could be spoken aloud for worship. And looking at the context, that would be the only place at which animals could be offered and the only place at which his holy presence would dwell. And that place ultimately turned out to be the Holy Temple in Jerusalem. And that's why in the days of the temple, it was only the priests, specifically the high priest, who would invoke God's name, using it during the priestly blessing. It was not appropriate or permitted or lawful for the common Israelite to pronounce God's holy name. I mean, it was the name that was pronounced by angelic beings in heaven, as it says in Isaiah, referring to the words used in the worship of the Lord by angelic beings. They declare every day, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." God's name was not and should not be pronounced in common speech or even in worship outside of the temple in Jerusalem. And this was something that Jesus and the apostles understood. In fact, Paul said this in reference to an experience that either he or a friend had in heaven. He said of that experience, "I know how such a man was caught up into paradise and heard inexpressible words which a man is not permitted to speak." Now, there are many theories as to what Paul meant here when he referenced words that man was not permitted to speak. But from a Jewish context, it seems clear that what was heard was God's holy name being spoken aloud by the angelic beings in heaven. It seems from Paul's words here and from the testimony he himself gave that he did not believe it was lawful to pronounce God's name. During one of his many trials, Paul clearly stated in his defense that he had done nothing against our people or the customs of our fathers. If Paul's practice was to pronounce God's name, he could not have claimed that he had done nothing against the customs of the fathers, since not pronouncing God's name is one such custom. Indeed, all throughout the writings of the apostles, Jesus and the apostles never referred to God by his holy name, but instead they always referred to God using circumlocutions, which are roundabout ways of referring to God without using his name. Perhaps most famously is the way that Jesus addressed God, with the word Father. He even said in the prayer that he instructed his disciples to pray, the Lord's Prayer, he said, "Our Father who is in heaven, hallowed be your name." So as disciples of Jesus, we are called to sanctify God's name, which refers to many things, but at least refers to treating God's name as sacred and set apart, which begins with not pronouncing it.